Doesn't work well.
I bet a lot of you have. So let's jump right into it. We'll do announcements at the end. And I've got some acknowledgements I want to make, but let's get into our program. Dave, are you ready to do the history minutes? Or
pretty much.
how much time do you need?
I'm still kind of contemplating the idea of seeing over Zoom and trying to come to grips with that. I'm glad that's not part of what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be speaking briefly about the Widowed Mothers Building Program of Kiwanis, and I've written the text out to avoid me from rambling, so forgive me for reading, but it's the most efficient way I think I can use the time. The Widowed Mothers Building Program emerged from the club's Boys and Girls Committee in the late 1920s. Local housing was then in short supply and expensive, often not available to those who had little means. At that time, the average annual family income was about $6,000. For a single woman, it was about $1,000 less. For those jobs available to women as clerks, waitresses, telephone operators, or farm workers, the starting wage was 25 cents an hour. The club's idea was that the club would build a home for a widowed mother and her children who might otherwise go homeless. Rent would be $15 a month, easily half the typical cost. Individual Kiwanis members donated the lot, the plans, lumber, hardware, and concrete, and the membership of Olympia Kiwanis as a whole constituted the labor force. The small single-story home was built on East 13th Street within walking distance of downtown, Olympia High School, and Lincoln Grade School. A widow and her 3 small children occupied the home for the first time in 1929. Club members found work for the mother and the oldest boy, with the result that all 3 children were able to remain in school. The plan was to build additional homes, but that was never accomplished. Over the next years, the home was occupied by several families in succession. Annually, Kiwanis members provided any needed maintenance and upgraded the furnishings as required. At about the time of World War II, or shortly thereafter, the name of the home changed. It was no longer the Kiwanis Widowed Mothers Home. It was now called the Helping Hand House. It was rented to an immigrant family, reflecting a change in the needs of the community. Kiwanis sold the house in the late 1960s, the proceeds going to the establishment of a new enterprise, the OK Boys Ranch. The Widowed Mothers Home was one of the early Kiwanis activities that sought to support needy children. It is unique in that it has left a physical legacy. The simple house that was the Widowed Mother's Home still survives in a remnant neighborhood now bracketed by the East Capitol campus and the freeway. As part of the activities associated with the centennial of Olympia Kiwanis, Kathy Thompson contacted the current owners of the home. Would they be interested in having the building designated as a City of Olympia Heritage Landmark? The planned sale of the property put the answer to that question on hold, but a positive response remains a goal of the Kiwanis History Committee. If things go as planned, we hope to be able to continue the designation process and place a marker near the home indicating the role that Olympia Kiwanis had in its origin and use. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. That was really interesting.
Could I ask, Jan, do you want to publish it, or shall I distribute the text if you're willing to have that happen?
If you'll send me the text, Jess, I would love to include it in the newsletter.
Nice.
That'd be great.
Dave Peeler, do you have a question?
I wondered if we had any photos of that home.
We have one photograph.
I have one that's the photo of what it is now.
I have one too, since it's only 1 block from where I work at the Washington Federation of State Employees.
And I have a photograph taken in, I think, 1952.
Oh,
That shows a bunch of Kiwanis members painting a house.
Oh,
Terrific.
it would be nice to have both pictures. Yeah. Then and now. Yeah.
Sam, do you have another question? Sam Reed? Go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly note, because we want to get to the program, that I've been to the home, looked at it. I've down the block is another house that has been designated a heritage home, and it's a wonderful plaque. I've talked to the staff person for the city of Olympia who does it. They're very eager to do this too. So we're going to move on this as soon as we get a new owner, assuming the new owner is okay with it.
Very good. Well, Sam, why don't you please introduce our guest speaker today while you have the floor.
Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Katya. Many of you have met her, or at least seen her when in the joint meetings with the West Olympia Rotary Club, and that's where I found out that hearing her comment that she would be a great speaker for us. Katya serves as the executive director of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Washington State Association, where she coordinates state government affairs and advocacy on behalf of 14 Boys and Girls Clubs organizations in Washington. She's a former CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Thurston County. She earned a Bachelor of Liberal Arts degree from the Evergreen State College, which Katya, many people in this club think that's wonderful, and a Master of Management and Leadership from Western Governors University. She's an avid traveler, reader, active community member, serving various boards, including Olympia School District Education Foundation, West Olympia Rotary, Family Education and Support Services. For over a decade, she's volunteered with the Expanding Your Horizon STEM Conference for middle school girls. Katya, Miltimore.
Hello, everybody. So can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for allowing me the forum to share some of my thoughts and observations. One of the things that's not mentioned in my biography is that I'm actually was born in Russia. I am a native Russian speaker. English is my second language, though I have lived in the United States since 1999. So, you know, I probably have now spoken English for the majority of my life because I was born in 1980. So, this last 10 months has been a really trying time for me because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I have taken it upon myself to really share, use the podium that I get by being a Rotary member and being a nonprofit leader and having many connections in the community. And so I have been doing a series of conversations, and this is one of them. I think it's maybe my 10th or so presentation. I've spoken to several church congregations, multiple Rotary clubs, Lions, and now I'm speaking to you guys, and I appreciate you inviting me to share my thoughts on the subject. So why do I have this particular interest in doing this? Like, what am I trying to accomplish with this? Well, I belong to an interesting group, so to speak, of Russians, and it's a significant portion of the Russian population who actually have close relatives in Ukraine. So both of my dad's parents are buried in Ukraine. They lived there since the early 80s. And then my dad's older brother and his whole family, and so his daughters and his grandkids live in Ukraine as well. They're ethnic Russians. They've lived there since the 80s. And they are now subjected to the horrors of war. Thankfully, their little town is not it's closer to Kiev, and so it's not in the area of immediate armed conflict, but they too suffer from daily air raid sirens. And of course, now they're subjected to all of the energy interruptions and just infrastructure destruction that the entirety of Ukraine is subjected to. And so I have a very personal stake in this situation, we reconnected recently with that part of the family, and so it's been extremely delightful. But to just connect with them, and then of course under this situation of the war, it's been very stressful. And I have many memories of Ukraine. So when I was growing up, we would frequently go to Ukraine and spend summers, 1 to 2 months in Ukraine, just enjoying the countryside, enjoying the culture, and visiting my grandma and grandpa and my uncle's family too. So Ukraine has always been near and dear to my heart. I've enjoyed, kind of studying their culture, and I have some clothing items that reflect the heritage. And so it's really hard for me to see my birth country inflict so much horror and damage to Ukraine. And so, one of the ways that we deal with trauma like this is by trying to understand what's the biggest question that I'm trying to understand in my personal kind of journey through this is how can that be that so many Russian people actually support this war? I follow a significant number of independent news media sources that are Russian and Ukrainian. I also have visibility to all of Russian state media, and so I can watch the videos and read what's being said and why the war is support and how the war is supported. So I am very much privy to the propaganda, because I speak the language really well and I come from the country. So a lot of things that are being said or being referenced make sense to me because I grew up in that environment. So I know what they may be referencing or, what historical facts, so to speak, they might be relying on. And so it's been kind of a significant journey, so to speak, to really read a lot and watch a lot of documentaries produced by independent media sources that oppose the war, and really try to understand some of the current opposition figures like Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, and some of these other men that have been imprisoned, to trying to really dig in and understand what is happening. And it's been really difficult, and some questions, of course, still remain unanswered. So just another little dimension to my personal situation. My dad served in the Soviet military when I was growing up. And so, in fact, I lived for 5 years during my childhood in northwest Poland, where my dad was stationed in one of the largest Soviet military bases in Eastern Europe. And so I have kind of an interesting perspective on Soviet military. My dad, while being a military officer at the time, was highly critical of the military machine and Soviet military machine that continues apparently to this day to be rife with theft and bribes and just kind of some of these ills that have, obviously, we're lucky that it's plagued the Russian military still because they weren't successful in their Ukraine campaign so far. But I remember, kind of complaints and discussions of that when I was 10 years old, and we were in Northwest Poland. And then we moved to the far east of Russia. I'm actually from St. Petersburg, so you may know this is in Western Russia, very close to Finland. But I actually lived for a year and a half in Vladivostok, which is the far east of Russia, near Japan and China. So quite a bit of experience. My parents also were very critical of the Soviet machine as a whole in the late 90s. Vehemently opposed the Afghan war that was led by the Soviet Union. And so, again, kind of grew up in this analytical family that always looked at the politics and didn't necessarily align with it, even despite my dad's membership in the Communist Party and being a ranking officer in the Soviet military. So, how does this all happen? And so I'll try to be quick. I know you guys only have maybe 20-25 minutes for me. There's a lot to cover. And so if I'm going through some things really quickly, please do ask the questions to clarify things as when we get to the question portion. So I think a lot of it boils down to, and it's going to be no surprise, to the use of propaganda by Putin and his regime. And the propaganda machine is so well honed and so well developed and has been building up to this moment for the last 2 decades, unfortunately. Just more and more that you read and kind of research and read accounts of different journalists that worked for some of the central TV and newsprint media sources, you realize that something was in the works for many, many years. Because the propaganda has really been working hard to build out the enemies and also kind of reframe the Russian society and some of its values. And who knows if this really has been in the planning for as long as Putin has been in power, but no doubt dating back to 2014 and a couple of really key events that happened in Ukraine in 2014. Going back a little bit to my note that I belong to a large group of Russians who have direct close family in Ukraine. By some estimates, 30 to 40% of Russians have a situation like me. So a brother or an aunt or a nephew or a cousin that lives and works and has lived in Ukraine for many years. So first of all, 140 million people in Russia. So the population of Russia is that size. And so if you do the math, it's probably close to 30 or 40 million Russians that have direct family relations in Ukraine. But then there's another staggering statistic, and I believe that number. And the number is that about 70% of Russians support the invasion and war in Ukraine. And so you have to realize that those two numbers must overlap. There is no math that would keep this very clean, right? And so there are absolutely tons and tons of really heartbreaking stories, even in my family, where my aunt, who lives in Ukraine, has broken off quite a bit of relationships with friends and family who are in Russia because they do not believe her accounts of what has been happening for the 10 months. And so it has happened almost in every family, and is just extremely devastating and hard to understand. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what can happen? What can be so powerful? What propaganda machine can be so powerful? And how is it built that sisters do not believe sisters, and mothers do not believe daughters, and just things of that nature? And the interesting piece to it is that there are many answers to that question, at least I have discovered over the last 10 months. But a lot of it is a lot of it is caused by Putin's fear of losing power and the extreme access to wealth that grip on power maintains. But then also, there's that fixation, as you probably, if you follow the conflict at all, you probably see from the media sources, that fixation on the West and the United States specifically, about having so much ill will towards Russia. And so a lot of that has been being built out by his machine to really be the dominant political discourse in Russia, that Russia is alone, that Russia has almost no friends, at least at the current global superpowers like United States and the European Union. The narrative is a little bit different about China, but if you're looking west, then there are only enemies, and there are no friends. Well, you may wonder, why does a peaceful and prosperous country need to build out this kind of enemy figure? And it all goes back to the kleptocracy that permeates Russian government and Russian economy, and how much of a disparity there is between the incomes of average Russian people, and then, of course, the world famous class of oligarchs that are in the list of world's richest people. And it's staggering what that differential is. An average salary across Russia is $500 a month. Now, cost of living can be very different to America. I mean, an average Russian would not have a $300,000 mortgage, kind of an average price of home in the United States. So you have to kind of understand that $500 is not the same as what it would be like to live in Washington for $500, but it's still significantly, significantly low. Any kind of loans or mortgages run incredibly high percentage interest rates. So they're usually double-digit interest rates on home mortgages. And then credit cards is nowhere near the average 20% that we have in the United States. It's more like the monthly rate is 20% and not the annual rate. And so there's a lot of predatory lending practices. And so it's really hard for people to build credit, access additional finances, and kind of get ahead in life by purchasing a home or running a small business. And so when that happens, you have to find somebody who is responsible for that. And of course, looking from the outside in, and I've been traveling to Russia over the years, every couple of years, since moving here in 1999, I've been lucky to go back home almost every couple of years. And it's been really interesting. Of course, I've traveled back to St. Petersburg, which is one of the largest and most beautiful cities in Europe. And so, my perception has been skewed because infrastructure and businesses and just everything that, you expect of a grand European city is there. But even if you travel just 100 kilometers outside of St. Petersburg, so a little less than, a bit less than 100 miles, the picture changes. There are roads that are barely functional. There are social services that are non-existent. There are schools and libraries and hospitals that are in total disrepair. If you travel even further from the center of country, or more kind of a globalized, industrialized Moscow and St. Petersburg regions, you're finding homes that don't have natural gas going into homes for heating or for cooking. And so people have to buy things like propane tanks to heat apartments and 4 or 5 story buildings. There are no plumbing, like some of the basic plumbing that's necessary for some homes. And this is a country that's so rich in oil and gas resources that its primary source of national income, where it cannot, provide this kind of services to its own residents. Meanwhile, Putin continues to sort of, lead the country and saying that all of our agencies and ministries and whatnot need to do better by the Russian people without taking personal responsibility for that particular aspect of Russian life and economy. And so things are very, very difficult in Russia. Well, who is there to blame? And of course, like I started to say earlier, for anyone looking from outside in, you would be blaming, Russian oligarchy and the kleptocracy that is abound in Russia right now. But the ruling party or Putin's world has created a different narrative, and everything that's wrong in Russia is the fault of America and the West. I have personal experience in that particular narrative. I traveled to Russia back in 2013 when doing one of my regular trips to go on a kayaking trip in the Ural Mountains with my mother and my younger sister. And I speak Russian perfectly fine, but maybe I have a little bit of just a different accent in how I speak, and after 20-some years in America. And so I tried to, just because I knew I didn't want to open a can of worms, I tried to kind of just not advertise that I actually permanently live in America. And, just start up personal conversations with some of the other kayaking trip participants who were from across different parts of Russia. But after about a couple of days, I just didn't want to keep up the ruse. And so that came up. And I knew part of the reason I didn't necessarily want to share that, this is where my living situation is because I knew the moment I did, pretty much every conversation in the group was going to turn around to talk about, America, the evil America that causes all of our problems, the State Department of America that gets involved in every single civil unrest in Russia. In fact, any civil unrest that happens in Russia happens at behest of the State Department of America, as though Russian people just don't have their own will and their own understanding of human rights and, civil liberties and freedoms. And so, and it was at points in this 10-day kayaking trips, it was unbearable to me because that's all that people were wanting to talk about, because you realize that it's everything that they hear from on the TV. So at this point in my presentation, you say, okay, that's all great, we got it. Putin's government tries to really propagandize these notions, and then American and anti-European notions about these are the people responsible for Russia's economic failings and Russia's inability to advance on the world stage in, maybe technology and innovation and things of that nature. How does Ukraine come into the picture? Well, Ukraine had made a choice many years ago, especially in 2014, to align much closer to the West. And I'm not sure how many of you have kind of looked into some of the origins of the conflict when the war had started. But what I have been really looking into myself has been the Ukrainian Maidan that happened in late 2013, early 2014, which was Ukrainian uprising against then President Yanukovych, who was pretty closely aligned with Putin and had vetoed a decision by Verkhovna Rada, which is a Ukrainian Congress, to enter one of the European Union accords. And so that was basically, a decision by him to annul this decision by Ukrainian Congress. And the people of Ukraine did not like that because they wanted to continue to see closer and closer alignment to European Union, potentially NATO and things of that nature, because that's the path that they charted for themselves after stepping away from Soviet Union in 1991. And in 2013, there was a significant step that was, kind of approved by Congress, but vetoed by President Yanukovych. And so Maidan happened. And Maidan was a revolution in the streets of Kiev. About a little over 100 people have perished as a result of several weeks of protests. Most of them were the protesters, a handful of law enforcement people. But as a result, Yanukovych was removed from power, and then they were able to ratify the vote and move forward with these plans. And then they continued on the path of, regularly elected new presidents. If you recall, there was another really important thing that happened about 2 months later, and that was the illegal annexation of Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which was done by Putin. And then there was all of this unrest and kind of a supposedly civil uprising in Donbass. I continue to, and I do not have a PhD in history. I don't have necessarily any kind of, social science or history degrees in general, but just through my, personal analysis and reading and, kind of learning. And I think many people agree that these moves were very much punitive moves by Putin. While they were presented as protection of Russian minorities in Crimea and Donbass region, I will tell you from personal experience that Russian minority in Ukraine has never been persecuted. I have, 10 family members that do not speak Ukrainian and live in Ukraine. They are ethnic Russians, and they have never once experienced any kind of issues with being ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. And so will millions of other families will tell you that this is all bogus and nobody needed protection from Russia in Crimea or in the Donbass region. So really, truly, the move was punitive to show Ukrainian people that they have this bully at their northern border that is going to be constantly involved in how they try to self-determine and what they try and do, but also to show Russian people kind of a show of strength that, we do not even think about any kind of popular uprisings similar to Maidan, because this is what can be done even outside of our own borders. Only imagine what can be done inside of our own borders. So that show of strength continued. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention, the show of strength inside the country is incredible. Again, depending on how closely you follow some of this Russia's evolution into the neo-Nazi regime that it currently is consistent silencing of journalists, of opposition figures. The murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was a very significant political figure a few years back, right in front of Kremlin on the bridge at night, was just a very shocking moment. You've got, like I already said, Alexei Navalny, which was a very prominent politician who was attempted to be murdered through poisoning, and then when he recuperated in Germany, returned to Russia, was jailed in the airport, and now serving like insane over a decade of consecutive prisoners. But then folks started to be jailed, and these jailings and murders were, well, not the murders, but the jailings were, sort of justified by some of these commercial misdoings or misappropriation of funds for some of these things that were made up. But now at this point, anybody who is speaking out against the war or the special military operation is being jailed and sentenced to 9 years of prison for just doing a YouTube stream about Bucha, the murders in Bucha, or walking out with a sign that is anti-war. When the war first started in late February, there were thousands of people that went out in the streets to protest it in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And about 1,700 people just in those two cities alone were arrested and taken in for questioning and for processing. So can you imagine 1,700 people being arrested in the United States between DC and New York if they walked out in the protest against, Iraq war or Afghanistan or some of these military conflicts that our country has unfortunately been involved with? And so, and it's really, really brutal. People are being beaten. People are being losing jobs because of their involvement with the protests. And so, in order to be, you can't be really brave in Russia because there's just no payoff. It's absolutely squashed at the earliest indication of dissent or disagreement. I did some comparative quick Google search on the number of a police force in the United States compared to Russia. Now, the United States is more than 2.5 times double the population and about 25% less active police force in the United States versus Russia. So the presence of the police throughout Russian cities and throughout this process has been really aggressive and very outnumbering the protesters to a significant degree. So, squashing any kind of internal unrest, closing down most of the communication channels, Facebook, Instagram, majority of YouTube continues to have significant number of limits on free speech and free press. And so people in Russia are continuously propagandized by these narratives of Ukraine, hosting a Nazi government and Nazi government and the prosecutions of Russians and just kind of anti-Russian Orthodox Church sentiments, and so there is just so much misinformation and so little ability to find information. If you are, especially if you're a little older, if you're like over the age of even 50, which is not old at all, but folks are not as fluent with local media technologies and where to look for information, how to sign up to independent Telegram channels, which I use a lot, how to discern YouTube content that is propaganda content versus kind of a more well-balanced review. So it's an absolute information vacuum. It's at least 8 years, if not more, of pro-Donbass, pro-annexation of Crimea, anti-Ukraine, anti-Ukrainian independence narrative. It's a lot of xenophobia mixed in as well, and absolutely revisionist approach to history. And this would be its own talk, really, so I don't want to really delve into it. But there's a lot of confusion because Russia initially started in Kiev. Kiev on Rus was the name of Russian Empire for many centuries, and Kiev being the center of Russian Empire at the time and being the capital city. But then, things change. Nations go their own ways, Russian government had moved to St. Petersburg first for 300 years and then now is in Moscow. And there are certainly ethnic, nations like Ukrainians who speak their own language, which I don't really understand very well. I can read and get about 50-60% of the content, but it's very unique in their own traditions. And so rewriting, the history to say we're all one nation and really there shouldn't even be a border because it's all just one happy country has nothing to do with history and has everything to do with Putin's nostalgia for USSR and for how things had worked for about 70 years. So apparently that was great stuff, which I can tell you living through at least the tail end of it, it wasn't. And it was very unfair to the 14 Soviet republics that were under Russia's thumb for over 70 years and how they were treated and how they were denied statehood and personhood. So I kind of covered just a lot of different things, but what my summary, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I want to kind of finish up here. The summary of it is that it might be fairly easy for us, at least, me having lived for a little under half of my life in Russia and then the other half of my life here. It might be, I noticed that for Americans sometimes, forgive me, I'm generalizing, but just a couple of observations. The questions come up like, well, they just need to know where to go and look for information. But even for us here, it's sometimes hard to differentiate what is true information and what is, generated by trolls, what is generated by bot farms. We have seen a bit of interference with our own elections. There are questions about how certain people came to power and whether Russia really aided in those particular processes. And there's just a lot of other misinformation that's really, really easy to promote, especially in this day and age with some of these really powerful information technologies. And folks are just not savvy. Very many people are just not savvy in understanding that's what's being spoon-fed for them by the TV channel in front of them that has identified a clear enemy and identified the person who is at fault for their very low paycheck and the terrible condition of their infrastructure and their roads. It's really, really easy for this propaganda to just, propagate, so to speak, throughout the minds. And there is definitely a cautionary tale, even for a democracy as advanced as America, that we always have to be vigilant about what we're seeing and what we're hearing and whether it's really true or whether it's serve a particular political agenda or a particular kleptocracy route. And then the other question I get asked a lot, actually, and then I'll kind of finish up and look at the questions in the chat that have been popping up, is that how is that Putin has not been just how come they haven't elected a new president? What's going on? They have elections every 4 to 6 years. Why? What happened? And this is probably simplifying the issue a little too much, but at the base level, America has over 250 years, almost 250 years of elections tradition, right? So we are used to going to the polls every 4 to 6 years, depending on who we need to deal with, right? And so we know that even if we made a choice and then the choice did not turn out to be so great, we maybe only have 4 more years of this person, right? And then we can go back to the polls and fix what needed to be fixing, right? And so it is in our DNA. And yes, I saw a question whether I have dual citizenship, and yes, I do. I'm American. I got my citizenship in 2008 so that I could vote in those very important elections in 2008. And so, we are used to the rotation of power and to the new person in the office. And I will never say new guy, because this will get fixed one of these days, that there will be a woman in the office. But we're used to that rotation. Whereas in Russia, you really have to think on a same grand scale of 250 years. Up until 1970, it was obviously an inherited empire where there was not a king, but an emperor or empress that rotated through the Romanov dynasty. 1917 to 1991, you had the dominance of the Communist Party, and so there wasn't really any elections. There was just an appointed boss for 70 some years. And then you move on to, the post-Soviet Russia, where there was pretense of elections, but there were a lot of things that went wrong in the 90s and how post-Soviet Russia and other republics were set up. There was just, again, a lot of interference with fair local and regional and state elections. And very quickly, that process was overtaken by some, kind of nefarious actors. And so then folks are just not used to that change of power. And so when I was talking to my mom about this, and this will be my last comment, I said, hey, Mom, why do you think Russians don't look forward to electing somebody new and bringing in fresh blood into the office? And she said, a lot of people believe that whomever comes to power enriches themselves to the nth degree. And so they steal and rob a lot, and they install people close to them who also steal and rob a lot. And so for a lot of people, elections actually mean that, okay, we are now getting a new person in the office, and now they're going to have to steal a lot because they now have access to all of these resources. So we might as well keep the old guy in, because at least he's stolen everything that he can potentially, his heart desires. And maybe for the re-elected time when he comes back to the office, he can actually focus on governing and legislating instead of, personal enrichment. But if we have somebody rotating in and out every 4 hours, it's just going to be a free-for-all, because that's what Russians think of people coming to power. That's the main reason why you become elected, governor or president or one of these other elected positions. So it's a very sad and very underdeveloped view on democracy and on rotation of power. But unfortunately, if again you take a long view at the history, 250 years, you don't have a practice of doing that. And when you tried in the early 90s and early 2000s, it didn't quite work out really well for you. And so it's probably just easier to keep the same guy that you already know his habits, you already know what he wants and doesn't want. And so you just continue on with Emperor Putin like you did up until 1917, and then you tried a different world order, which also didn't work for you. So there's just a lot of kind of electoral misfortune, I would call it, in that post-Soviet Union Russia and some of the other republics. So I'll pause here. There's quite a number of questions here. So let me just do very quickly. Recommended readings for those of us who only read English. Yes, actually I do. New York Times just posted a really incredible, it's not even an article, like people who have read it said it's like a mini book that I had forwarded to my husband, and it's called Putin's War, the Inside Story of a Catastrophe. And so I highly recommend that if you have, especially if you have a New York Times subscription, I mean, my husband started reading it yesterday and he's still not finished. It's a really significant commitment of time, but it actually was recommended by a very prominent Ukrainian filmmaker who has received Oscars and has done Hollywood blockbusters and has done, and he is now, one of the strongest anti-war critics in Ukraine. And he had read a translation of it and felt that it was just an incredible journalistic feat accomplished by New York Times journalists. And so he recommended it both in Russian and in English. And so again, it's called Putin's War, The Inside Story of Its Catastrophe by New York Times. And it was just published a couple of days ago. What have you seen of Russian propaganda in US social media? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think now I'm just going to, state my political position and my political preference, and hopefully that doesn't offend anybody. But obviously, the misinformation about the Biden versus Trump elections and kind of the election interference and the claims of fake and phony election results in that particular election, a lot of pro-Trump information is been proven to be supported by Russian propaganda bots and bot farms in St. Petersburg itself. So that's one of really good examples of Russian propaganda. And then, it's hard to discern because they're, speaking in English and they have very much American-looking profiles. They are, a candy shop owner somewhere in Illinois that is just absolutely red, white, and blue. Stars and stripes type of social media profile, but it's not that folks that support Trump are not Americans, but I guess what I'm trying to communicate here, sometimes folks who are really very much pro-Trump may not be, and pro-election misinformation more specifically, may not actually even reside on this continent, and that's fairly common. In the US, we hear about Russian separatists in Ukraine. Any truth at all in those claims, or is more Russian propaganda? Yeah, my personal take is that majority of this Russian separatists, and specifically in Donbass region, that's where all of this bloodshed has started with Donbass, that continues to be contested territory. Yes, Russian separatists, in my personal belief, were planted by Putin's, FSB, like security forces, into Donbass to start all of this mess back in 2014. So maybe of course, there were some folks locally who, once these units have arrived or these individuals have arrived, that for one reason or another, most likely because of promise of financial remuneration, joined that, and they were Donbass residents who may have had some beef with Ukrainian government, because everybody has beef with their government, regardless if you live in Nicaragua, France, Ukraine, United States, right? So you can always find folks who are disaffected and unhappy. And so I'm sure local residents were involved in that, but I am pretty confident that the initial beginnings of this all started with plans from Russian security forces in those regions. Do you have dual citizenship? If not, how difficult is it to enter into each country? I have dual citizenship, so I answered that question already. And so I use both passports depending on which border I'm crossing. And that's fairly common with some other folks with other, like, Canadian American citizenship or French American. 2 questions. Regarding Putin's health, what if he dies? Who is in the wings to replace him? How would that play out? Yikes. Not a good situation, not at all. There are multiple folks lined up based on everything that I'm reading, and none of them are good news for anybody involved. There's a a man by the name of Rogozin, who is the private military force owner. We probably seen Wagner, heard of Wagner private military force that's fighting in Ukraine on the side of Russia. And he is extremely militant. He's almost medieval in his approach to just the conflict and how it's managed and how folks who enlist in his private military forces, how they're treated. And so it's very, very scary. There is also, that's not likely, but some people speculate that there's a region in Russia that's ethnically very different from Russians. It's Chechen, and you may have heard of Chechen wars in the 90s and early 2000s. and it's now kind of like it's a autonomous republic within Russian Federation. And so Ramzan Kadyrov is the kind of a warlord almost turned governor of that region. And so folks believe that he might be angling, he's fairly young, he's in his early 40s, angling to, divvy up, right, if Putin is gone or dead. I don't really see that. That would be just an Armageddon scenario for that to happen because of just his pattern of behavior is very concerning. So, and then, but all of the opposition is eliminated in Russia. And so there is not really an opportunity for fair elections with so much brainwashing that's been happening for a decade about all of these opposition figures really being paid agents by the United States State Department. And so Russians would not want any of the opposition figures leading up the country because they don't believe that the opposition figures have the country's best interests at heart. And so it's just extremely complicated. We're all kind of used to not used to, but we always hope, right? We're an optimistic nation and we hope for a happy ending or some sort of, nice tied bow at the conflict. I personally do not see an easy resolution. I hope Ukraine wins, right? And I hope we see that them prevailing on the battlefield and potentially even returning Crimea in the next 6 to 8 months. And I definitely think that is realistic. But what will continue happening in Russia will continue to be an absolute mess with continued jostling for power between people who really shouldn't be allowed anywhere close to power. And then the second question from Charles was, Putin has said that NATO nations would be a logical Russian target as NATO is providing so much assistance to the enemy. How serious should we take this threat? I'm not a military strategist by any stretch of imagination. I think it's fascinating to me. So the two things that I find the most fascinating, so I probably won't answer that question directly, but in that particular regard, the two things that I found the most fascinating in the last 10 months is and this is something my husband's sick and tired of hearing from me, it's kind of this rhetorical question of how ridiculously unstrategic this invasion was because of how unprepared Russian military was and continues to be, and how that has just completely revealed all of Russia's inefficiency and just inability to, perform what should have been a fairly simple campaign, right? And it has just gone so terribly wrong for them, which completely revealed the state of what they call themselves the second most powerful military in the world, and it's a laughing stock of the entire world right now. So that's the one piece about NATO. And then, of course, now with Finland and Sweden potential admission into the NATO alliance, Russia was trying to keep NATO away from its borders by preventing Ukraine entering NATO. And now they've just, doubled their shared NATO border by Finland and Sweden's almost imminent admission into the alliance. And so these blunders are just so laughable, and I just don't understand. Well, no, and I do. It relates back to my initial, very early comment in this presentation, is that 32 years ago, when I was 10 years old and my dad was complaining about how absolutely rotten the core of Russian military is with theft, bribes, incompetency, that has not improved in the intervening 32 years. It continues to be the case about Russian military, but for the first time in history, the world has actually seen this core, and it's been just an absolute embarrassment. Not that I wanted Russia to, be strong and prevail in this, but if you have an image to maintain and be a threat to NATO and the United States, this is not what you do that they've been doing for the last 10 months in Ukraine. Karen, history book. Yep. So those are just a couple of recommendations. So awesome. Thank you so much. Yep, that's the New York Times link. So thank you so much for that. And then I'm scrolling back. So Dave Peeler, U.S. economic response to Russian war in Ukraine and maybe worsening the situation for many Russians, while at the same time, the cost to Russia of the war must also have a huge impact on their own economy. So I will tell you, and this has been some of the most disconcerting pieces of information that I have recently come across. there is absolute certainty that the American and European sanctions on Russia are not doing enough. And I mean, that might be obvious, but what I have recently read from a couple of really reliable sources is that while there are these oil and gas embargoes and the pipelines are turned off and some of these, oligarchs are sanctioned and the bank accounts are frozen, majority of Russian ammunition and, the rockets, the drones and a lot of Russian current, contemporary military arsenal is actually built with a significant number of American and European components. Those things are continuously being sold to Russia and being imported. So while there are economic sanctions that are affecting banking and then affecting, oil and gas purchases, there are actual reports. I find them to be credible. Hopefully, maybe that can be proven wrong, that there are actually American and European armaments manufacturing that are continuing to supply certain components to the rockets that are falling on Kiev and some of the other, across the Ukraine. And so, the sanctions are imprecise and they are hurting Russian people, but not bad enough. I talked to my family in Russia and they're doing okay. Yes, certain brands like Apple and Microsoft have left and H&M have left Russia. Russians can't watch the newest Hollywood releases. They don't have the Big Mac anymore, or Baskin Robbins has pulled out. But that is something that Russians, especially those who support the war, are kind of proud of. They're like, whatever, we'll make our own Big Mac. Our Russian ice cream always has been better than Baskin Robbins, and screw you, Chanel, and whatever else. We have our own, and then so it's like, oh, this is just will encourage the rise of Russian brands, and we, for now, like we've always been saying, don't have this dominancy from American and Western brands that are flooding our market and not allowing our own brands to be competitive in the marketplace. So every single one of these moves have been turned around into a patriotic propaganda that is supposedly giving the rise to, Russian innovation technology in various industries. Let's see. And then a thank you from Charles. All right. Hopefully I did not completely derail the timing of your meeting.
Katya, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you for spending so much time with us today. We all learned so much. It's incredible. We could do this every week for a year, and there's still so much there. So thank you for taking time to be with us today and sharing your insights. It's so appreciated.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your attention and I appreciate your interest in this topic. We all need to do just a little bit more to help this conflict end.
Well said. Well said. Well, with that, we've got a few minutes left. Well, we're just at about time, but let's do some announcements and happy dollars. There's lots to be grateful for. Anybody have a happy dollar they want to, Terry?
I'll do a happy dollar and an announcement. I'll do 10 happy dollars for just the presentation that we heard today and the courage and just the insights that we got. Announcement wise, Mary and Kathy and I, three of the people on our Caring for Kids committee, we went over to Case the Joint at St. Martin's. We got the place lined up and we took a look at the amount of tables and the setup of the room. So that's all set. We have all the table captains from last year, and we're having a meeting tomorrow at 2 out where I live out here, and we're going to go through our next big push is going to be recruiting you guys as table captains, and then trying to fill those tables to get people to come to the event. So that's what we'll be working on.
Thank you,
And I thought we might have Christine Gregoire as our speaker, but I found out today she's going to be out of state. She called me back and she can't do it. So we're still looking for a wonderful keynote, but we'll find her.
I'm sure we'll find it. Thanks for all your work on that. Sam.
Happy dollars for the bell ringing for the Salvation Army. I thank all the Kiwanians. They were great. They did a wonderful job. It's the key clubbers just blew us away, as Charles commented afterwards. Gives you faith in the next generation to see these terrific young people. So thank you very much. And I guess I'll make a program committee announcement. Somebody heard earlier that our next meeting is January 3rd, Tuesday, January 3rd. So it's unusual, but we aren't going to meet between now and then. And it's going to be a preview of the 2023 legislative session with State Representative JT Wilcox, who's the House Republican leader, and I believe State Senator Sam Hunt, who's of course.
And in person, Sam,
Pardon me?
is that in person?
It'll be, no, it'll be via
Zoom.
Zoom. So,
Use it. Thank you, Sam. John Halverson. Where'd you go?
Unmute
you are.
yourself, John.
Muted, my friend.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to see if I could get a flyer or a brochure about the Caring for Kids so I can start recruiting people to my table.
That's one
And
of the things we'll be doing tomorrow, John.
okay, and Terry, if you vote many more times on the survey, we can be live every Monday at Tugboat.
So, no.
Get in there and vote.
Yes, to that, but I'll be checking for double voters. I know who you are.
oh, Killjoy.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for everything that you've been doing this month, from bell ringing, which I participated in for a couple hours in the morning, which was amazingly inspiring. I was just blown away by the generosity of folks walking by and the energy of the key clubbers. Sam, thank you for organizing that. Everybody who participated, thank you. Thank you. It's so much fun. The Adopt a Family and Giving Tree with LP Brown and McKinney Elementary was a great success, thanks in large part to Kathy Thompson's organizational efforts and all of your amazing generosity across the board. Thank you for that. There's just been so much going on, and just from my perspective, I'm just in awe of the ability of this group to make real positive change in the community. So keep it up. Great job.
And Oli on Ice, don't forget that.
Oh,
That
Oli
was
on Ice,
fun.
thank you. I knew there were 3, and I was like, I can't remember. Thank you. Oli on Ice was a lot of fun. A lot of work went into that from a lot of different parts of the organization, and that was just a great way to get out.
Also, the poinsettias, I bought one for myself and one for my Capitol Lake Towers. I have a big, beautiful thing down in the lobby, and everybody that comes by, I'm going to put a sign, Kiwanis Club gives
good.
their love.
There you go. There you go. That's a
People are
great idea.
stunned. So beautiful.
Karen
Well,
Fraser.
Yeah, and then the wood pile people were chopping wood out in the snow too.
Wow.
Yeah.
This
And
month,
there's some
yeah.
photos on our website highlighting that.
Oh,
their-
good.
Oh,
and their
cool.
social, because those are great photos you sent over. So absolutely. Keeping people warm. You guys are keeping a pace, I hope. There's a lot of need, and you guys are doing amazing work. So I think that's it for everybody. Have a great
Happy
Christmas,
holidays.
holidays.
Yep.
We'll see you on the 3rd for our next meeting. It'll be right here, same place, same time, except it'll be on a Tuesday.
Another
we'll reach out
wonderful
to you.
year will begin.
All right, thanks everybody.
Merry
Bye.
Christmas.
Merry
Merry Christmas all.
Happy holidays.